At 79 years old, Van Morrison still isn't the kind of man to bite his tongue. For decades, fans have heard rumors about his fiery temper in the studio, but nobody expected what happened recently. In a rare and surprisingly raw interview, he looked straight at the camera and said, "There are 6 drummers I'll never work with again. Ever." The room went silent. For a moment, even the interviewer didn't know how to react. Was Van serious? Was he joking? But then he leaned forward, eyes narrowed, and started telling stories. Stories that went way beyond music. Stories about betrayal, ego, chaos, and even danger. The first name he dropped belonged to a man from the early 70s. Van didn't hesitate. He said this drummer had the skill, no doubt, but also an ego the size of a stadium. During rehearsals, the man would showboat, playing flashy fills that had nothing to do with the song. Van claimed it ruined the groove, and when he told him to keep it simple, the drummer snapped back. "Maybe your songs are too simple." That was the last straw. Van fired him mid-tour, right after a gig, in front of the entire crew. But what came next shocked even more. The second drummer on Van's blacklist wasn't just someone who clashed with him musically. This man had been a close friend. They'd shared drinks, hotel rooms, and long nights on the road. But one night in Chicago, after a show, Van walked into the dressing room and caught him bad-mouthing him to other musicians, saying Van couldn't keep time and relied on the band to cover his mistakes. That betrayal cut deep. Van said he never spoke to him again, except once, to tell him, "You're done here." The third name? That's where things started to get really strange. Van leaned in, lowered his voice, and said this drummer had a habit that made him impossible to work with, and it had nothing to do with music. He paused, looking at the eyes. Interviewer with a faint smile. "Let's just say," Van murmured, "when you start a set with 4 drinks in you, it's only going downhill from there." But Van wasn't done. He promised the next 3 names would shock people even more, because they weren't just about music. They were about loyalty, about trust, and about the one time a drummer almost destroyed an entire Van Morrison tour before it even began. The tour that almost never happened. Van Morrison's eyes narrowed when the 4th drummer's name came up. This wasn't just a clash of personalities. This was a near-career disaster. It happened in the late 80s, right before a highly anticipated European tour. The band was set, the rehearsals were tight, and ticket sales were through the roof. Van was in rare form, sharp, focused, and ready to deliver. But 3 days before the first show, the drummer vanished. Gone. No calls, no messages, nothing. At first, Van thought maybe it was a personal emergency. He told the crew to keep calm, that the guy would show up. But the next day, the truth surfaced. The drummer had accepted another gig behind Van's back with a bigger paycheck. He didn't even have the guts to quit in person. Van described that moment as one of the most humiliating of his career. Not because the drummer left, but because he had to scramble to find a replacement at the last second. He called up an old friend from Belfast, flew him in overnight, and somehow they pulled off the first show. But Van swore that day he would never forgive someone who turned their back when the band needed them most. Then came the 5th name, and this one, Van said, was the most painful of them all because it involved family. Not blood family, but the kind of brother you make in music after decades of playing together. They had toured the world, written songs in dingy hotel rooms, and even stood up for each other during tough times. But somewhere along the way, the relationship soured. Van said it started small. A missed rehearsal here, a strange excuse there. Then, one night in Boston, Van overheard the drummer talking to a record label executive, pitching his own solo project. The catch? He was using Van's unreleased material as leverage, offering to rework it for his own album. The betrayal hit like a punch to the gut. Van confronted him backstage before a show. The argument turned into a shouting match, and Van admits he walked on stage that night with his hands shaking. It was the last time they ever shared a stage. By now, the interviewer was leaning in, barely breathing, but Van still had one more name to reveal, the 6th and final drummer he'd never work with again. And this one, he said, was in a category of his own. The others, Van said, were just bad choices. But this one was dangerous. The room went still. No one knew what dangerous meant, and Van wasn't about to give it away without telling the full story. He took a sip of tea, looked up at the ceiling, and began. The dangerous one. Van Morrison's voice dropped low when he started talking about the sixth drummer. It wasn't just that he disliked the man. Van said this was someone who could have ruined more than just a show. It happened in the early 90s, during a stretch of shows across the U.S. Van's band had just brought on a new drummer, a guy with unbelievable speed and power. On stage, he was electric, but off stage, there was something unsettling about him. At first, it was small things. He'd disappear for hours before a gig and come back jittery, eyes darting. He'd mutter to himself during sound check, pounding the snare like he was in a boxing match. The band shrugged it off. Eccentric musicians weren't exactly rare in Van's world. But then came the night in Denver. Just minutes before going on stage, the drummer exploded in a rage over a minor sound issue. He threw a cymbal across the room, missing the bass player by inches. Security had to step in. Van said he was still shaken when he walked out under the lights. The final straw came a week later in New Orleans. Midway through the set, during one of Van's quiet ballads, the drummer suddenly shifted into a thunderous solo, completely off cue. The crowd didn't know what was happening, but the band did. Van turned around and saw the wild look in the drummer's eyes, like he was daring someone to stop him. After the show, Van called an emergency meeting. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply said, "He's gone. Tonight." And just like that, the dangerous one was out. Van leaned back in his chair and smiled faintly. "People think I'm hard to work with," he said. "Maybe, but if you're in my band, you show up on time, you respect the music, and you keep your head straight. That's all." These six didn't. But then Van did something no one expected. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a worn notebook, and flipped to a page filled with names. Some were scratched out. Some had stars next to them. And right at the bottom, in bold letters, was a single phrase: "Never again." The interviewer leaned closer. "Are those all the people you'll never work with?" Van chuckled, tapping the page. "Let's just say," he replied, "drummers aren't the only ones on this list." The camera lingered on that notebook as Van closed it slowly, leaving everyone wondering, who else was written there, and why were their names blacked out? The hidden list. The air in the room felt heavier when Van Morrison closed that notebook. It wasn't just a prop. It wasn't just for show. This was the list. The one people in the music industry whispered about, but never actually saw. Van rested it on his knee and tapped the cover with his fingers, almost like he was deciding whether to say more. Then, without warning, he opened it again. This time, just enough for the interviewer to glimpse a few lines. There were names written in big block letters. Some had dates next to them. Others had single words like betrayal or lied. A few were heavily scribbled over, the ink so dark you couldn't read what was underneath. The interviewer tried to push. "Are these all musicians?" Van gave a slow grin. "Not all. Some are producers, managers, a couple of label guys, and one was a friend for 40 years. That last sentence hung in the air. A friend for 40 years? The audience could almost feel the weight of it. Van didn't explain right away. Instead, he leaned back and told a story that drifted back to his early career, before the fame, before the sold-out tours. He spoke about a man who'd been there since the very beginning, playing tiny pubs and smoky back rooms. They'd scraped together coins for bus fare, split sandwiches on the road, and shared dreams about making it big. But when success finally came, so did the cracks. Van claimed this friend once signed a contract in Van's name without telling him, a deal that almost locked Van out of his own music rights. Van's voice hardened. "Now that's the kind of thing you don't forget. You don't forgive." The interviewer asked if that friend's name was on the list. Van just tapped the notebook again and smiled faintly. "Some names you keep as a reminder, not because you want revenge, but because you don't want to make the same mistake twice." Then he did something unexpected. He flipped the notebook shut and slid it into his jacket pocket, almost like locking a door. But before the conversation could shift, Van leaned in and said, "There's one more thing people don't know about this list. One name that's never been crossed out. The one I'd never dare to remove. And it's not because I hate them." The interviewer froze. "Then why keep it there?" Van's eyes glinted and a small, knowing smile formed on his face. Because that person knows something about me, something nobody else does. The silence that followed was thick. The camera caught the way Van's fingers tapped on the armrest, almost in rhythm, like a heartbeat waiting to break into a song. And just like that, the conversation wasn't about 6 drummers anymore. It was about one name, one secret, and a question that would haunt everyone watching. Who was it? And what did they know?